Down.
Welcome to the Joel
And Emma
podcast, where we give you in-depth explanations of United States history. On today's episode, we are going to dive in to the topic of the Vietnam War and its aftermath on American society.
The Vietnam War is a large and convoluted issue, so first we are going to give a brief history about the war. We will not be able to cover the whole war, but we are going to give you some of the main ideas in order to provide a proper amount of background information.
The Vietnam War was an extremely long conflict that roughly started in 1954 and eventually ended in 1976, causing a lot of controversy along the way. It put the communist government of North Vietnam against South Vietnam and its main anti-communist ally, the United States.
With tensions rising between the North and South of Vietnam, in 1955 the U.S. pledged to support South Vietnam and began to supply the area with military equipment so that they could crack down on the Viet Cong, who were communist sympathizers. This resulted in over 100,000 people being arrested, tortured, and killed.
By 1957, the Viet Cong began to fight back, and by 1959, the war between the two sides was in full force. In 1961, the American military was sent into South Vietnam to back them up and push back the North Vietnamese communists.
President Kennedy was working on the domino theory. He assumed that getting involved in the war would spark the involvement of many other countries, and the conflict would come to a quick halt. However, this was not the case, and the fighting continued.
In 1964, America tried the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. They began employing regular bombing raids. Between 1964 and 1973, the U.S. dropped 2 million tons of bombs on North Vietnam and neighboring Laos.
This did not get the war any closer to being resolved. In fact, some say it made the situation worse. Meanwhile, in South Vietnam, the war was mainly being fought on the ground. Civilians were told to evacuate the area, but many stayed to fight and protect their homes.
By 1967, huge war protests were being held in America due to the rising number of U.S. soldiers that lost their lives or were severely wounded. Many Americans suffered from PTSD after being involved, and this stayed with them for the rest of their lives. Sadly, many are still suffering today. Vietnamese and Americans alike.
In 1968, the communist fighters took the U.S. by surprise by conducting their Tet Offensive attack. This nudged the American president to stop bombing raids and instead start to seek for a peaceful solution.
In 1969, the Americans withdrew from Vietnam, leaving South Vietnam with training and weapons to continue fighting. Sadly, the war between the two sides of Vietnam continued until 1973, when the U.S. and North Vietnam concluded a final peace agreement. In 1975, the Communists gained full power of the country, and in 1976, the country was united as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam.
Overall, the Vietnam was a long, costly, and divisive conflict that pitted the communist government of North Vietnam against South Vietnam and its principal ally, the United States. The conflict was intensified by the ongoing Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. More than 3 million people, including over 58,000 Americans, were killed in the Vietnam War, and more than half of the dead were Vietnamese civilians.
Opposition to the war in the United States bitterly divided Americans. Even after President Richard Nixon signed the Paris Peace Accords and ordered the withdrawal of U.S. forces in 1973, Communist forces ended the war by seizing control of South Vietnam in 1975, and the country was unified as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam the following year.
Now that we have some of the basic information about the war, it is time to dig into the main topic itself. the effect of the Vietnam War on America and its citizens. To kick this off, we have a special interview with someone who was a college student during the peak of the Vietnam War. Welcome, Waldron. Today we hope to discuss undergraduate students' knowledge of the Vietnam War and the effects of the war on the Vietnam War generation.
Sounds great. I am ready whenever.
You were a college student in 1968 and 1969, the worst years of the Vietnam War. What were your thoughts about the war when you were an undergrad?
I had a very unusual set of experiences before the Vietnam War, which enabled me to put it in an international context. When I was a teenager, I had gone to school in Europe for a year as part of an exchange program. I discovered that there was a teacher who organized groups to go to the Soviet Union, so I signed up. Starting in my senior year of high school, I traveled to Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. This was at a time when they still felt confident and we still thought they were going to overtake us economically. I traveled all over Eastern Europe and communist countries, and that basically persuaded me that the information about communism coming from America was indeed not propaganda, but in fact, a place like East Germany really was a lousy place to live. A lot of people came to the Vietnam War knowing only America, so if you said, there are communists fighting in Vietnam, they didn't really know what communism was. But I had been exposed to it very thoroughly. It's sort of like being vaccinated. So when someone told me about how great Ho Chi Minh was, and how he was going to make Vietnam into a paradise for the Vietnamese people, I said, I heard that before.
What are some of the effects of the Vietnam War on the people of your generation?
I think everybody who went through it was affected. Everybody who was an undergraduate or was around 18 or 20. The only comparable group I can think of are the people who were about 5 years or so older than me, who were in the civil rights movement. I know people who went to the South in the days of real old-fashioned segregation, and the imprint of the experience on their characters was very, very deep, and it really formed the rest of their lives.
Very interesting. This was an extremely difficult time to live through. How did the war affect you on a personal level?
It was extremely educational, and it strengthened in me the belief that I had to get out of the American bubble, because America is big enough that you can think it's the world, but it's not. It's very different than the world. I had to get out of this American bubble. I had to go somewhere that is completely different. I had to do something that's worthwhile, but is hard work. And I had to let my brain kind of come to equilibrium, because at that time I couldn't figure out which way is up. So I went out and I studied in Taiwan and learned Chinese. Basically, that's the beginning of the story of how I ended up here. That was partly a reaction to the Vietnam War, because the Vietnam War, among other things, was a display of American ignorance about foreign countries.
Thank you so much, Waldron. That is all we'll be asking from you today. Thank you very much for your time.
No problem. Happy to help.
From Waldron's interview, we got a unique perspective on life during the Vietnam War and how actually being internally connected with it allows for direct insight into the effects and the results from the war itself. We really appreciate him taking the time to do the interview. The Vietnam War had far-reaching consequences for the United States. It led Congress to replace the military draft with an all-volunteer force and the country to reduce the voting age to 18. It also inspired Congress to attack the imperial presidency through the War Powers Act, restricting a president's ability to send American forces into combat without explicit congressional approval. Meanwhile, Hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese refugees have helped restore blighted urban neighborhoods. The Vietnam War severely damaged the U.S. economy. Unwilling to raise taxes to pay for the war, President Johnson unleashed a cycle of inflation.
The war also weakened United States military morale and undermined, for a time, the United States' commitment to internationalism. The public was convinced that the Pentagon had inflated enemy casualty figures, disguising the fact that the country was engaged in a military stalemate. During the 1970s and 80s, the United States was wary of getting involved anywhere else in the world out of fear of another Vietnam. Since then, the public's aversion to casualties inspired strict guidelines for the commitment of forces abroad and a heavy reliance on air power to project American military power.
The war in Vietnam deeply split the Democratic Party. As late as 1964, over 60% of those surveyed identified themselves in the opinion polls as Democrats. The party had won 7 of the previous 9 presidential elections, but the prosecution of the war alienated many blue-collar Democrats, many of whom became political independents or Republicans. To be sure, other issues such as urban riots, affirmative action, and inflation also weakened the Democratic Party. Many former party supporters viewed the party as dominated by its anti-war faction, weak in the area of foreign policy, and uncertain about America's proper role in the world.
Equally important, the war undermined liberal reform and made many Americans deeply suspicious of government. President Johnson's Great Society programs competed with the war for scarce resources, and constituencies who might have supported liberal social programs turned against the president as a result of the war. The war also made Americans, especially the baby boomer generation, more cynical and less trusting of government and of authority.
Today, decades after the war ended, the American people remain deeply divided over the conflict's meaning. A Gallup poll found that 53% of those surveyed believed that the war was a, quote, well-intentioned mistake, while 43% believe it was, quote, fundamentally wrong and immoral. Overall, the Vietnam War left many lasting after effects on not only those who lived through it, but also present-day life. From anything to the economy to political parties, nothing was safe from the aftermath of the war. We would like to do a special thank you to our interview participant, Waldron, for his thoughtful and reflective answers to our questions. It was very helpful to get such a unique and powerful insight to the war itself. Something that personally stuck out to me as I researched for today's podcast was the Democratic Party kind of falling apart, because I did not really know of that effect. Well, that's all for today, folks. Thank you for tuning in to the Joel and Emma podcast and learning about the aftermath of the Vietnam War on America. Tune in any Friday at 3 a.m. for more history facts. Never stop learning.